One of my good friends who's an award-winning author and written a dozen books on human values, civil rights, and spirituality will be on the Martin Luther King Jr. panel I'll be moderating Monday evening at the JCC. And since this is Shabbat Shirah, which is translated as Song of the Sea, but it's actually a lyric poem, even more than a song. My friend, Rabbi Ben Kamen, just wrote a poetic book about moving forward from what Mitzrayim, Egypt, means in Hebrew, the narrow places. His book is strangely titled The Blessing of Sorrow. It's about winding through the wilderness and vicissitudes of life, knowing and believing that there is a better place, what we call the promised land, and finding the right hands to join in reaching that better place, which is a state of being, since the goal, as we learn from Moses, is not the destination, it's the journey itself. Well, unlike his other writings on Martin Luther King, Rabbi Kamen, in this new book, shares his own life story following the sudden death of his father during his first year of rabbinical school at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, where Rabbi Katie and I were both ordained. David Bierman's daughter, Rabbi Rachel Bierman, was also ordained there too. Ben's dad died at the age of 45 while playing handball at the Cincinnati JCC. And not knowing how to move through his own personal wilderness at age 23, he writes, "I got some help, not from the rabbi who spoke at the burial and confused my father's first name with mine, and not from a therapist or grief counselor. Sure, my religion offered rituals that were ancestrally soothing, a daily service every evening called a minyan in our home for a week, covered mirrors, small stiff seats for mourners, memorial candles, and the inevitable endless trays of deli. But," then he writes, "I soon got two better remedies that launched my recovery and helped me move forward through the wilderness. The first was a solo walk in a park, and later, a visit from my astute uncle who arrived from Israel. After everyone had returned to their normal lives, with Ben still stuck in the wilderness, he got into his car and he went to French Park in Cincinnati. Ben's dad had favored it for an occasional family picnic, and he and his dad would often hike along its creeks, discussing life, Ben's future, and his dad's work as an aerospace engineer during those early days of manned spaceflight. Returning to that park alone, Rabbi Kamen's grief spilled into the Japanese roses more naturally than it had during the daily minyan at the family shul. Ben writes, "I could see my dad and me throwing a baseball back and forth in this park. I could see his thick, dark, curly hair that would never be streaked with gray because he died so young. Then Ben arrived at the popular covered shelter in the park where birthday parties for kids are often thrown, but that day it was all his own. A breeze filled up the space, and Ben thought he detected the pleasant scent of his father's trademark Menin aftershave lotion." He writes, and I quote, "The shelter in that park became my synagogue. That was the day I first discovered how to move through the wilderness." The next day, Ben's uncle arrived for a 3-month stay. Moshe was his mother's older brother. His dad and Moshe had fought side by side in Israel's War of Independence in 1948. Moshe was a chain-smoking, gravelly-voiced, opinionated, extremely adoring of his entire family circle patriarch who looked something, according to Ben, like an Israeli version of Tevye the dairyman. Ben writes, and I quote, He was no stranger to death and the wilderness, having killed men in war and witnessed many of his childhood friends and soldiers under him slaughtered. When Ben's dad died suddenly and his mother immediately called Moshe in Ashdod, Israel, to ask him to fly over to Cincinnati and spend a few weeks with them, Ben heard Moshe say, "I'm on my way," but Ben was also shaken to hear the Israeli family patriarch sobbing. When Moshe arrived, he found a traumatized family in need of a father figure. 2 or 3 nights after his arrival, Moshe invites Ben to take a walk under the stars. Ben writes, "My uncle did not attempt to disguise his grief. It weaved its way into his weather-worn face, moistened his deep, dark eyes, and occasionally made his normally powerful voice to crack. But there was some kind of peace walking with just him through the wilderness, looking skyward while pacing alongside my uncle," Ben writes. "I recalled something I read in a prayer book. The stars are there even when you can't see them in the daytime." "Are you looking at heaven?" Moshe asked Ben with tenderness. "I suppose I am." Ben, the first-year Reform rabbinical student, replied as Moshe put his arm around him, "Your father and I used to do that many years ago as campfires burnt out during the war. The night stars were soothing to us because we feared death every day. We agreed they were the lights of heaven." So this exchange, more mystical than usual for Tevye the Israeli dairyman, prompted Ben to ask the question that plagued Ben the most since his father's sudden passing. So Ben asked it, "Uncle Moshe, where is my father?" Moshe stopped walking, thought about it, and said very deliberatively, "Ben, I knew your father, and I can tell you that he's in a good place. But how do you know that?" Ben retorted. "Tell me something," Uncle Moshe said, focusing on Ben soul to soul. "Your father was very particular, and he didn't have patience for trivialities. So if it wasn't a good place, don't you think he'd come back?" Ben ends that part of this book in the following way, and I quote, "Uncle Moshe's bit of raw theology and folk formulation has helped me a lot over the years. It really was tender and intuitive. I was calmed by his roundabout way of telling me how much he loved my father, and the notion that my dad would simply come back if he was unhappy has continued to give me both a measure of comfort and a warm chuckle over the course of time. Holding on to that little burst of hope, like my interlude at French Park, helped me move forward through the wilderness. It helped me to find a tender location in my soul for my dad." Where is your loved one? Ben ends his essay. Your loved one is safely at home in your heart. My dear friends, on this Shabbat Shirah, whether it's our ancestors 3,200 years ago fleeing Egypt frightened at the sea, or any wilderness you may be passing through right now, whether it's a soothing conversation with a relative or a friend like Uncle Moshe, or if it's the presence of someone who inspires you like the wind at your back in a French park pavilion, joining hands and hearts with someone is the only way any of us can get from here to there, wherever we stand at this moment in time.